In the last part of our talks for this evening's symposium, we have a guest speaker, Dr. Deshpande, who is the founder and president of a company called Universal Regulatory Inc. This is a company that provides consultancy services to pharmaceutical companies that are interested in pursuing a compound through the process of clinical trials and FDA approval. She does this both in the US and also in the EU. We thought it would be interesting to ask Dr. Deshpande to come and talk to us a bit about that process, because all of the courses are working on some form of therapeutics. They're understanding how a disease works. And she might be able to provide some insight both into how that process takes place and also how she ended up where she is, which is in quite an impressive position with a PhD. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Deshpande. And Dr. Deshpande, you can take it away whenever you're ready. There might be a problem with the audio. It looks like you're working on fixing it there. So we'll give you a minute. Take your time.
Yeah, I hope it works now.
We can hear you now. It's good.
Perfect. Okay. So let me start again. I want to take this minute to thank Pam for inviting me to speak at the symposium. And what I want to talk today a little bit about is drug development from an industry perspective. And I just want to share my screen again, if you don't see it yet. Give me a minute. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. All right. So a little bit about myself. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 20 plus years. I did my master's and PhD in pharmaceutical sciences in a field which is now starting to get realized, and it's gene therapy, and you're now starting to see some products coming close to getting approved. So what I've been doing is I set up my consulting practice about a little over 10 years ago, and we are focused on advising companies on drug development and regulatory affairs and providing them with a framework of getting their drugs through the drug development pathway through approval. And so what I thought in my 15 minutes, I have to take on this tall task of talking about drug development. I'm going to touch a little bit on drug development pathways and talk a little bit about careers in drug development. And finally, talk about a topic close to my heart, which is the complex negotiations with health authorities that go into getting a product all the way from discovery through approval. So you may have seen a slide of some of this sort in different forms, but the take-home message here is that drug discovery is a long and risky road, and you can see the initial funnel in the pre-discovery stage can be as large as 5,000 to 10,000 molecules, which eventually ends up in one drug getting approved. So the funnel is pretty steep, and it is a long process. An average medicine can take about 10 to 15 years to get approved. So who are the contributors to this process from an industry perspective? It all starts with research. Drug discovery research can come from various sources. It can come from academia. We've seen some great presentations by Harriet, for example, talking about phage therapies. It can come from startup environments. It can come from well-funded pharma companies. And it can also look very different. You can have products like small molecules, you can have biologics, monoclonal antibodies. There's a whole new wave now of cell and gene therapies, which are probably going to get realized in the next 10 years or so. There's complex technologies like nanobots with medical devices. So a lot of exciting stuff happens in the drug discovery world. But once you identify your development candidate, it now gets sort of transitioned into the drug development arm. And this is just, what I have on this slide is some of the typical departments you would see in a pharma or a biotech company. And what I want to point out here is these are people who have very diverse skill sets that come together. So you have on the right side, you have the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls group. These are people who are manufacturing your drug. They're making sure it's manufactured consistently, it's stable, it's packaged right, it's tested, and so they control how it's made. Then you have the preclinical development group. These are the folks who are testing your product animal models, for example, making sure that the drug is shown to be safe in animal models. Then you have the clinical development group. Here too, there are diverse individuals that come together. You have the MDs and the PharmDs that are working to design the types of studies you're going to do in patients and healthy volunteers to show that your drug is safe and effective. And then you also have the operational folks. So these are people who know how to run trials. They can be small trials in 10 to 15 subjects, or they can be large trials and thousands of patients that are being conducted globally. And these are multi-million-dollar studies, and so they need to be executed right so that you can maintain the integrity of the data and you can make the case that your product needs to be approved. So that's the clinical arm. A very critical arm is the quality unit. The quality unit interfaces with all of these various departments to ensure quality of the product as well as the integrity of the data that you're generating. Then BD and marketing. If you have a business degree, you might find a career in drug development because you might be involved in licensing and partnering your molecule. You also have the commercial arm where they help you decide what your product needs to look like. What is the target product profile of your drug? It would be a shame to spend 10 to 15 years developing a drug only to find that it does not have critical attributes that would allow it to be accepted by patients and physicians. And it surprisingly enough happens more often than you might think. Where there are major flaws in recognizing what really does the patient and the end user want. And so this commercial arm is important to be able to guide, the people who are in the chemistry group or clinical group in terms of what are the things that the end product or the end user is looking for. And then the regulatory affairs, which is dear to me, and that's what I help companies with. And what this group does is typically we help and guide all of these various stakeholders by providing a framework of what are the development requirements for every stage as your product is moving through drug development. And I'll talk a little bit about this in my next slide. But one of the other key roles is regulatory affairs also helps the company interface with one of your most important stakeholders, which is the health authorities. In the US, it's the FDA. In EU, it's the EMA. And we work as a liaison to kind of negotiate the kind of development program you will need to get this drug approved. And I'll speak to that as well in a little bit. So what I want to kind of bring home with this slide is that drug development brings individuals from various backgrounds and their careers for a diverse set of professionals in drug development. So let's look at the stages of drug development. We had some it talks about some of the discovery work in some of the student presentations today. And there are various approaches to drug discovery. And as I said, it can come from various different sources, different methods. But I think once you have identified your lead candidate, or once you have a candidate that looks promising, then you are now moving into characterizing it further in preclinical studies. You're looking at in vitro models, you're looking at in vivo models, ex vivo assays. So you're trying to look at how does this product behave, how does it act. Then you want to also characterize the pharmacokinetic profile of your product, which is ADME, which is absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. And this is important to do early, because if you did not have a product with a favorable pharmaceutical or a PK profile, it may not be a viable candidate for the type of disease you're treating. For example, if you had a medication for pain, say a headache, but you had to administer it intravenously, it probably wouldn't be a viable candidate. So you have to look at that. That's a very key part early in development, to look at the PK or profile of the drug. So then you're kind of moving into proof of concept studies. These are studies where you're testing to, is your drug working in the disease model that you are targeting the drug for? And once you do that, once you establish proof of concept, it kind of puts you in a different mode. You're now starting to put your development hat on. You're starting to think about, how am I going to formulate this drug? How am I going to deliver this drug? Do I need a device? There's a lot of talk about antibiotics that was given earlier. And, for some of the conditions like cystic fibrosis, there's a lot of activity, for example, in administering it using an inhalation device. So those are the things you start thinking about. What is my product profile going to look like? How am I going to design it to set it up for success? So all of this information now starts building into what we call the IND application. So this is the investigational new drug application. And this package includes a combination of pieces. You have the manufacturing piece, you have the safety studies and animal models, and then you also have to start talking about the clinical study design. So you kind of move into the next phase, which is the clinical, the phase 1, the phase 2, the phase 3s, and then you're talking about establishing the safety and efficacy of the product. So then after you do that, you're now going to the grand finale, if you will, which is the FDA approval, where you're filing your NDA or your BLA, and you're going through the whole rigor of review by the FDA or the EMA, and that's what gets your product approved and commercialized. But it doesn't stop there, and you also have to continue monitoring it post-approval for safety, etc. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of drug development. But as my daughter pointed out to me, it's never a straight line. It's always drug development happens in bursts, and there are successes and there are setbacks. So it's often a long, windy road. So in terms of doing this, there is a whole bunch of things you need to be aware of. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I know I'm kind of short on time, but there's the acts, the regulations, the guidances, and on the European side, there's directives and national laws, because EU is a consortium of multiple countries. So you really have to be on top of this as you design how you develop your drug. So we talked about INDs and new drug applications. So this slide just shows you what an IND or an NDA looked like when I started, which was a whole truckload of folders with all the data. And we used to spend days QCing and making binders and shipping them off to FDA. Thankfully, that's changed now and it's moved to an electronic format. But this is what an IND or an NDA content looks like. The good news is harmonized globally. So all countries recognize this format. And this is how you would provide the information that would go into your NDA or your IND. You have the three pillars. I call them the three pillars. On the left side, you have the quality pillar, which we talked about, the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. Then you have the non-clinical, and then you have the clinical on the right. So all of this is what the FDA or the EMA will look at before deciding to approve your product. And the FDA is a complex organization, and this is just a partial description of what the organization looks like. And we have to decide exactly which division and subdivision we need to go and interact with based on the product we're developing. And so I'm going to end or get to towards the end of my talk and talk a little bit about some of the cool tools in the drug development toolbox. And these are things that are ways to expedite drug development. We talked about antibiotics earlier, and the QIDP, which is right up here on in the top here, is a mechanism where FDA fast tracks or speeds up development of these. They offer incentives, they give you extra attention, you have access to meeting with them and getting an opportunity to get their feedback. So these are mechanisms whereby you fast track, or QIDP allows you to get more attention from FDA and fast track your development. You may have heard about all the buzz about the COVID vaccines and wondered, well, how is it that they're getting approved in less than 1 year when a typical approval cycle, a development cycle is 10 to 15 years? Well, a lot of that has been fast-tracked through a mechanism called the emergency use authorization. And this allows FDA to relax some of the requirements that are needed for a typical drug, for things like pandemics or bioterrorism threats, for example. And so that's the mechanism that's being used for these approvals. I heard, I believe it was Aiden talking about azacitidine and repurposing that drug, which is approved for an oncology indication, to maybe an antimicrobial application. A product like that would use the 505(b)(2) mechanism so that you can use and leverage some of the information already generated for azacitidine and don't have to repeat all that work, and can reference some of that. So these are just kind of some. I could probably give a talk on each of these boxes, but my point here is that as you develop drugs, you have to be aware of some of these mechanisms so you can leverage them to really bring your product to market as quickly as possible. So I think in conclusion, I personally think drug development is a balancing act. You're balancing multiple considerations. You're balancing the quality of your product through commercial goals, while maintaining a tightrope with your regulatory strategy to product approval. But what I can tell you, it's a truly fulfilling career. It's a lot of fun, and it's great to try and bring some great new products to patients with unmet medical needs. So I think with that, I will stop. Thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'm hoping I can figure out this chat bar, but I'm happy to take any questions.
We can read the questions to you. Thank you so much. I think that your talk was really interesting because it brings a new perspective, not only to the type of work that the students are doing, but also the types of things that they could do with their molecular biology degree if they choose to pursue a science career. I think it's fantastic to hear something outside of sitting at a bench and pipetting, which is what we're all doing right now. Somebody mentioned that the emergency use authorization is like a fast pass for Disneyland. And I think I'm interested, and I wonder if other people are thinking the same thing, that there must be a trade-off, as you said about, everything's a balancing act. But when something is fast-tracked, are there trade-offs like safety? I think that that's something that people think about, like how much information goes into an emergency use authorization compared to a traditional FDA approval.
So I don't think they're compromising on safety and efficacy. I think that some of the areas where they do give what I call regulatory relief is some of the manufacturing requirements, which are very take a long time, like stability data. For example, when you're developing a drug, you have to have a minimum number of months of stability data that you have to provide. You also spend a lot more in making the product very commercially viable. Like I believe it is I think it's the Pfizer product that has to be stored at minus 70 degrees. Now, this is a very challenging thing for a typical commercial product to have to maintain that cold storage chain. But given the fact that this is a pandemic, I think, and there is the support and the weight of the US government behind it to set up the infrastructure for distribution, the company has, been able to say, well, let's not spend that 1 year developing a formulation that you can store in a regular refrigerator at home. So this is where you kind of sort of take some of those pieces out, which are time consuming. And maybe, they will come out later with some second generation or next generation product if COVID continues to be, an issue. And, I'm sure it's not going to go away completely. So one would envision that once, this initial generation of vaccinations is done, the companies would look at second generation products, which are more friendlier. More data is provided to show stability, and some of these things that were missed in the first round are done later.
We have a number of questions. Is someone chiming in?
Sorry, Pam, may I chime in?
Of course, yes.
Thank you. So I'm a bit confused how what you said wasn't about safety. Shelf stability of a product, I mean, if it has to be kept at minus 70 and it's no longer minus 70, then according to the company and the proper usage.
No, it will be at 70, but what you would do.
I mean, like in an ideal world, it will be at minus 70, but we don't live in this, ideal world. If you try to get this drug to less developed nations, if you try to get it transported across a large area like the United States, I mean,
it's a balancing, and I don't know who's asking the question. It's a balancing act. So I think it is a decision you have to make. Now, you may decide to say, hey, I'm going to wait for another year, develop this perfect formulation, but delay rolling this out. Or you can say, well, let me do it in steps. Let me get a minus 70 product out on the market, which is, we are in a pandemic situation. Let me make sure I have the infrastructure to support the distribution of such a vaccine. And then, this work I'm sure is going on in parallel. People are not stopping the research, but sometimes you don't have the luxury to wait. Now, for a typical drug that, we do for most other programs where there are other existing treatment options, you may not, that's why this EUA process is there. It's not there for any random product. It's only there for something like a crisis, like a pandemic or a bioterrorism threat. FDA will not issue an EUA unless it is absolutely imperative that this product be commercialized.
Someone in the chat is asking about minus 70 degrees. Our students are used to dealing with 4 degrees, a refrigerator, minus 20 degrees, a freezer like in our kitchen. But could you explain minus 70?
I'm not working on this COVID program, but so I don't know the specifics of their distribution chain. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of discussion about a lot of dry ice being used. And I don't know what their strategy is. I know Warp Speed, which is the program by the U.S. government, probably has a plan on how to maintain this cold chain. But I'm not on this program, so I'm not privy to those details. But that will be part of that. And both vaccines don't need it. I think the Moderna vaccine, which is the second vaccine, I don't believe that needs the minus 30, which is one of the pluses of that vaccine. So right. Different products have different pluses and minuses, I believe.
having worked with RNA, somebody asked in the chat also, what's the difference between freezing and freezing? And having worked with RNA myself, when I store things in a regular freezer, they degrade, even though it's frozen. It's like you can get better than frozen at minus 70 degrees Celsius. Somebody asked, is the process of approval different for vaccines than for like a drug that you would take to treat a disease?
You know, I haven't done much with vaccines, but vaccines are regulated by another division within the FDA. So a lot of the work we do is with CBER and CDER, but we focus mostly on small molecules and biologics, but not vaccines. It's a whole different beast, honestly. But it does go through a different division at FDA, and they have their own special set of requirements for what, particularly because, as you know, vaccines are updated every year, like the flu vaccine. They're based on how the virus is mutating. It's not the same product every year, so it's almost that they're issuing or releasing a new version of the product depending on the virus that's going to be circulating for that year. So it's not something I have direct experience with, so I don't know how much more I can say, but yeah, the requirements are likely different.
So I'm going to ad-lib some of the questions because we're starting to see themes in the chat. There are people asking about patents. So our students have learned a bit about patents and how we're trying to incentivize pharmaceutical companies by giving them longer patents or giving them patent extensions. But one of the questions that came up specifically is when does a company file for a patent? Like when do they begin their ownership of a compound?
So it's very it's company specific. It's not just companies, it's labs, right? Patents come from all sources, right? And I think sometimes it's even a financial reason. I've seen some really small groups struggle with having the capital to pursue the global patent process. But the sooner the better, because but one thing I'll add is, in addition to the patent, so you do have patent protection for drugs, but the regulations allow for another protection, which is called exclusivity. And what exclusivity, it's data exclusivity and market exclusivity. What that does is once your product is approved, there is a period where other Me Too products are blocked from referencing or the product your product, so making generic versions of your product, for example. So for small drugs, small molecules, it's about 5 years. For biologics, it's longer. So that is the protections from an exclusivity perspective. There are also exclusivity protections for orphan drugs if you're developing product for rare diseases. So those are separate from the patent protections. But I hope I answered your question. The point I was trying to make is you need, if you have a new technology or a new drug, a new molecule, a new process, it's best to get it patented as soon as possible. I'll tell you one thing, an interesting anecdote. I'm dealing with one of our clients, and you cannot believe this happens sometimes. This is a product in late stage development in phase 3, so large multi-million-dollar trials ongoing. And the company is dealing with a situation that they just identified that the method or the process they're manufacturing their drug with is infringing on a patent from one of the big pharmas. So it's a bit of a quandrum now, because they have to now at this stage come up with a way to bypass that patent so that they're not blocked. So these things happen, yeah. So they happen quite often, and then that's why you need to have a good patent attorney or a consultant advising you to maneuver all this.
I think one of the last themes that's coming up, of course, people have a lot of questions about vaccine development and also about insurance costs and how are decisions made to cover generic versus sort of the name brand. But I think the bigger picture, it seems like the theme in the chat is people are interested in hearing about how a price is set. And I think for people who are just hearing about how pharmaceuticals work for the first time, I don't know if all of the classes talk about this stuff. Could you, I know it's going to be different for every company, big or small, or the amount of investment, but could you comment on some of the factors that go into pricing a drug?
Yeah, and it is a very complex. I don't mean to punt on your question, but it's a very complex set of algorithms that go into setting pricing. It includes things like what is the standard of care and how much better are you from the standard of care. For example, if we had a situation where we developed this really cool drug device combination for diabetics. It was a way to administer insulin by inhalation. And the reason I bring this up is that this product was great, got through approval, but failed commercially because it was not reimbursed. Because the payers took a position that, well, people can inject themselves, and we're not going to pay for this 3 to 4 times a premium just to avoid the fear of injections. So unless a patient can demonstrate this morbid fear of injections, the insurance will not cover it. So those are the kinds of things you have to think about, and you might design your trials so that you have a better shot of getting a fair pricing. Because you want to use comparator drugs in your trial to show you're better than them, so that you can get a much more favorable assessment on the pricing. So it's a pretty complex set of, there are almost dedicated groups within larger companies who focus on this aspect so that you kind of are set commercially for success.
It's actually very reassuring, I think, that you have pressure from the company to make the money, but also some, pushback from consumers who say, no, that just isn't possible if insurance companies won't cover it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for coming. Students, please stick around. We are going to have awards announcements from Dr. Nancy Guild in just 1 minute. So I'll turn it over to Nancy whenever she's ready.